Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the HauntCon virtual experience. We're very excited to have Leonard Pickel here today to talk about the triangular grid system. Before we start today, just a quick housekeeping note. This session is available pre-recorded and on demand, so you can watch whenever it's convenient to you. But if you have any questions for Leonard, you can see his name right below this presentation. You can click to his profile and message or set a meeting with him at any time during the HauntCon virtual experience, which is taking place January 19th through 21st. That being said, I'm excited to kick it over to Leonard to start the session.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us at HauntCon virtual experience. We're looking forward to having a great few days of education and camaraderie between the haunted house industry. You know, with COVID going on, we're kind of cut back as far as us meeting in person. So hopefully this will give everyone a little bit of taste of Halloween, and hopefully everybody's getting ready for Halloween 2021. The haunted houses that opened in 2020, even though they were limited on many of them were limited on how many people they could put through per hour. Almost all of them did phenomenal numbers. So most of them maxed out. So we're looking forward to, even with the trailings of COVID in 2020, to having a huge Halloween year, huge haunted house year. So we're looking forward to everyone getting started and working on how to make their events better and how we can take advantage of people being crazy cooped up and ready to get out and do some fun stuff. This seminar is about the triangular grid system, and it is a little bit out of the box, a little bit thinking, outside of the box, thinking more inside of the triangle. And I came up with this a long time ago, and so I'm going to go through on how I came up with the concept of the triangular grid system, some of its advantages and disadvantages, and really just kind of where it came from. My background is architectural. I started doing haunted houses early, and the triangular grid system is something that fits into that. And so we're going to go through a little history. My first haunted house was in 1976 in a college dormitory. Really just kind of did it for bare money. We were open for a couple of nights, did some really phenomenal numbers, had a great time. And so it was at that point, I kind of realized that it would be something to do, something that might be fun to do for profit someday, but I was planning on being an architect. I graduated with my architectural degree in 1980 and moved back to Dallas and started apprenticing. I worked at several different architectural firms throughout my life, and I've designed everything from prisons to hotels and haunted houses, obviously, to museums. But I always found that architecture is an incredible format of art, but no other form of architecture affects the people going through it like a haunted house does. So even though some people might say I'm not using my degree, actually I really am. So in 1980, I volunteered with the March of Dimes in Dallas, who was the big haunted house at the time. And I chaired their event for several years. And one of the things that was cool about it was that we're in 1980, which is kind of an interesting, cross of situations that may or could have missed, and I might not even be here talking to you today. But in 1980, the March of Dimes came up with this bizarre concept. Previous to that year, they had been finding vacant buildings and trying to build haunted houses in them. They would stick build them, they'd frame them up, plywood the walls like you would a house, perhaps, and then decorating them. But then when they had to move to a different location, they had to take all that apart, and all they ended up with was plywood and 2x4s. But in 1980, the March of Dimes came up with this crazy concept, new to the industry, really, and that was the 4x8 panel. They started building walls as 4x8 sections, and then that way, when they took the haunted house apart, they didn't have to reframe it every year. They could take those panels down, store them someplace. They were already painted black, set them back up the next year, and they were, at least several steps ahead of where they were when they were trying to frame the thing out individually. At that time, we were building with 2x4s and OSB. OSB was like $6 a sheet at that time, so it was really cheap, and it was really hard to get the the nonprofit to fork up enough money for plywood. So a lot of the haunted houses were made out of OSB, painted black, set up. But one of the problems with all that is that you still had to screw through the plywood. To attach the panels to each other, you still had to screw that 3-inch screw through the panels to hold them together. And since you had a 4-foot panel, it made a whole lot of sense to create a 4-foot by 4-foot grid and to set your panels on. So when you're designing a haunted house, previous to the triangular grid system, you would lay out this 4x4 grid. Then you would set your walls on top of that, mark where your panels are going to sit, and then you ended up with a floor plan that looked something like this. But again, the problem was, how do you attach the panels to each other? What system were you going to use to attach the panels to each other? And back in 1980, we weren't using cordless screw guns. We were using nails and hammers. So we ended up using duplex nails and trying to nail these things together. Eventually we went to screws, but we tried bolts at one point, but it's really hard to get those holes to line up with if the floor isn't perfectly straight. And eventually we went to screws. So eventually we got to where we were using 3-inch screws, screwing through the 2-bys to hold them together. And the problem with screws is that once you come in and paint over the top of that screw, it's really hard to find. So the 3-inch screw was a good solution at the time, but when you were taking the thing apart, sometimes you would think you had all the screws out of 2 panels, but they weren't coming apart. Sometimes the paint just glues them together and they'll snap apart. But a lot of times we were wrecking the panels trying to take 2 things apart that we thought we had all the screws out of, but sure enough, there was a hidden screw that got painted over or something, and it was wrecking the panels. So it did a lot of damage to the panels. So, and the other problem is screwing through a 2x4 is really a pain. I mean, that unless you've got a really good screw gun or now a hammer drill, cordless hammer drills are brilliant for that. But screwing through a 2x4 is really hard. And I kept trying to figure out a way to not have to do that. How can we attach these panels together so that we don't have to screw through the 2x4s? And as I mentioned, I just graduated from Texas A&M University with an architectural degree. And one of the things that they teach you in architectural school is kind of architectural history. And the binding principle between all architecture, really, and really even any product design of any kind at all, is that form ever follows function. And the idea of that is that the shape of something, no matter what it is, a building, a hammer, a computer mouse is a good example of that. The form of any object is primarily based on its intended function. You can get a mouse that looks like a real mouse, but the idea of the form of the thing being secondary to the function, what is it designed to do? What are we trying to do with it? And because of that, in architecture, when you design an actual residence for somebody, you design from the inside out. You always want to know what is going into that space. Is it a bedroom? Is it a kitchen? Is it a bathroom? You then lay out the furniture and the fixtures. You lay out the cabinets. You lay out the island. You lay out you make sure the tub is in a good spot. You make sure that the size bed that you want is in the room. Do you need a nightstand? Do you want a dresser? You arrange the furniture first, and then only then do you draw the walls around the outside of it. And that's another completely different seminar that I do on designing a haunted house from the inside out. But the principle still holds. And this kind of stuff is fresh in my head because I just graduated college, and so all of this architectural history stuff was in my head. But what happens when you're designing something that you're not sure what's going to be in the space? You're not sure what the use is. It's going to be a multi-use space or a museum that has a revolving exhibit or something in it. What happens when you have something like that? How do you utilize how do you make the building look interesting and not just be big square blocks? So enter Walter Nesch, who came up with a thing called field theory. And he decided, he just from an artistic standpoint, he took squares and rotated them, and then took those rotated squares and turned that into a pattern. And then he would take that pattern and lay it underneath his, we were drawing with a pencil at that point. So he laid it underneath his vellum sheet, and he would place his walls on top of these different lines to create interest in the room. So you're just not getting square rooms. At least now you're getting some rooms with some 45s, the corners cut off, and the smaller spaces are bathrooms, the larger spaces are kitchens. So this was a theory on how to create an interesting architectural design, an interesting space, when you didn't know exactly what the use was going to be inside of the attraction. And it was very popular in the 80s when I first graduated from college. That's a sample of a floor plan that utilizes that same concept of the rotated squares. And so again, this underlayment idea had just come about as it was fresh in my head as I graduated college in 1980. And then the other thing that I just done was some structural classes. And in structure, in the structural classes, they tell you never to use squares, because if you look at these 4 boards and you nailed each one of these, you put a nail in the corner of each one of these, it's not a stable shape. It's going to rack back and forth. But all you have to make that stable, all you have to do is put a diagonal board across it. So triangles are always stronger than squares. So what you're trying to do is shape everything in structure as a triangle. So again, this was fresh in my head as I was doing this, and started thinking, well, in this situation, if you put a nail in the corner of each one of these boards, that's a solid shape. That's not going anywhere. And if we were doing that, well, what if those were panels and they were bracketed to each other instead of screwed to each other? Now we have a very strong system that's freestanding, and you're not having to screw through the 2x4s. So this is an example of a triangular grid, and you can find this in some office stores. They call it isometric graph paper. It's used for drawing isometric views, but it also is great for the layout of the haunted house. And if you'll think about this, what this does for you is it creates not only a pattern, a pathway that's very confusing and bends a lot, but it's also very structurally sound because of the triangles. So in that kind of a situation, we would lay out some walls on top of that. Where would the panels be if we were doing this triangular grid? And if we pull the grid off, this is similar to what a typical floor plan would look on the triangular grid. And you end up with these little V-cuts, these little anomalies, little corners. And within the March of Dimes days, we would stand a volunteer actor in the dark, in a dark robe with a flashlight, and wait for people to walk by, and he'd turn the flashlight on his face and scare people. We called them boo corners. But then on the perimeter, we utilized them for emergency exits. So we would hinge a door here and let it swing closed. So as people were walking by it, it just looked like a wall, but all you had to do is push on it and go out. And that's an advantage of having these little dead spaces in the plan, is that you can then utilize those for emergency exits into an egress corridor, get people out of the attraction. If you just have a door on the outside and it swings into the egress corridor, it actually blocks a corridor, and that's not allowed by code. But if you have these little notches, now you've got a way to get the people out of the pathway, out of the maze, quote unquote, of the attraction into the egress corridor. So the first time this was ever used was in 1982, the March of Dimes. We did a haunted house in a tent. It was the first time they'd ever done it. It had been a tent haunted house in Dallas. Again, that was an idea that was borrowed from the JC, from the March of Dimes in San Antonio. They had done it. They started using a tent. It became harder and harder in Dallas in '82 to find a vacant building that you could put a haunted house in, but you could easily find a vacant parking lot, or we were actually in the parking lot of an old drive-in theater that we built this haunted house in. And so that was the first use of the triangular grid system, was a plan. They asked me how big of a tent I needed. So I grabbed a pencil and paper and designed the haunted house. I told them I could do it in a 40 by 60 tent. They rented this tent. I showed up after work to see them setting up this tent, and it was like, oh my gosh, that thing is way too small. So I stuck the front of my truck underneath the edge of the tent with the headlights on, and literally marked the grid on the floor, marked the whole floor plan out just to make sure that it would fit in that tent because it looked so small. But we opened it up. It was very successful. The biggest problem that I had was, when your wall is 4 inches thick and you're putting it in at 120-degree angles, which occurs a lot, you have a lot of big, ugly connections. So the very next year, we took all those panels apart and changed them to become more common with what we use for it now. In the triangular grid system is not just a grid. It's not just the triangular grids and trying to throw typical panels in it. The triangular grid system is a freestanding system. You don't have to brace it anything. It's not attached to the floor. It's freestanding, so it doesn't. You don't have to screw stuff into the floor, mess up the floor. Later on, because we were doing these in parking lots, and I got tired of walking through my Victorian bedroom, and there being parking striping on the floor, we started getting carpet remnants and laid those out on the floor to set the panels on top of. And that was a great idea because it helped hold the panel in place, and it was much nicer to fall on if the patrons going through tripped or fell or whatever. It was much easier on skin, hands, and that kind of stuff. There was park on the floor. And it also made the room look better. But the triangular grid system is a way to build a panel because you're not having to screw, use 3-inch screws to drive, one screw through another 2x4, and we'll get to that in a minute. But it's the fastest way to set up or change a layout, and it's the strongest system of putting panels together that I've ever seen in the haunted house industry. And those are some of the advantages. So what did we do? In that first year when we had all those panels that were 4 inches thick and the connections were weird, again, from structural class and architecture school, they taught you that if you take 2 pieces of plywood and screw those to a 2x4 frame, with the 2x4s laid flat in the frame, you call that a bond beam. So you're able to span greater distances with 2 pieces of plywood on both sides of 2 2x4s than you could even with, a double 2x12 or something much larger than that. I call it a box beam. So the concept is to make these panels like a bond beam. So now we have, in this case, it's 2x3 or 2x4 uprights, 2x2 cross members, one at top and bottom and one across the middle, a full sheet of plywood on one side. And you can put a full sheet of plywood on the other side like the next frame will show. But in the case of a one-sided panel, you want to put little plywood corners on it, little gusset plates on each one of the connections, because it's the plywood that's holding the panel together, not the 2x4s. You do not have to attach the 2x's to each other. It's the plywood that's holding everything together. And that makes the assembly, the building of the panels much quicker, because it allows you, because you're not having to pre-drill the 2x4s or drive the 2x4s, or drive the screws through the 2x4s, and then you got to make sure that there's no gap between the 2x4s because the screw pushes the other piece of plywood out, so you got to back it up. It's just much easier, much quicker, and a much stronger panel, to be honest. It has less chance of racking. So this is what a 2-sided panel would look like. It's got plywood on both sides. I put this 2x, not dead center in the middle, but about at 3 feet. That's where the majority of people will hit the wall if you're trying to keep people from breaking through the wall. And I also, it gets out of the way if I want to put a window or some kind of opening for an actor or something above that. I'm not having to cut through that 2x2. So I lowered that instead of having it at 4 feet, I put it at 3 feet. But it's basically 2x2s, 2x3s or 2x4s in the uprights, and then plywood on both sides. And typically 3/8-inch plywood. CDX plywood is the cheapest material you can find. There's a haunted house that was built this way with OSB, 1/4-inch OSB on both sides of that. That's been in operation since the late 80s and is still in operation today. You can go see it. It's in Galveston, Texas. It is still in operation. It's summer seasonal, so it doesn't get the kind of traffic that an October seasonal show would. But even with OSB, we were able to create a pretty good system, and those panels last. Those panels, you're not going to be, having a situation where those panels are falling apart. They last for a long time. So now that we had, single-sided panels and double-sided panels, the other thing I didn't want to do is have to stick built-in doors. So we made actual panels that were doors. It always bothers me when I go through a haunted house and I'm walking down a hallway and I go into a kitchen or into a bedroom or into a closet or something, and it doesn't have a door frame. in a typical house, as you're walking through a house, you're walking through door frames periodically. So these panels allow us to be able to put those elements in of a door frame to make it feel more like a closet, make it feel more like a bedroom if you walk through a door frame. And I'll even have an open door, screwed to the wall so nobody can move it, but I'll have a door in the door frame to make it feel more realistic. So then again, some of the panels will have windows in them as well. Just any kind of actor opening drop panels and those kind of stuff will all be built into the panels. And then we also have situations like, as I showed you, where the little V-cut has got an access door in it. Those I do very similarly, except that they're 1x4s instead of 2x. We'll cut them down short so that they're not quite 8 feet tall, so that you can so that they swing easier. And those are the doors that I utilize. They're 4 foot wide, a little bit short, 2 inches short or so that they can swing underneath the bracing, and then hinged on one side. So all of these pieces are things that are affected by, or that we build and utilize as pieces for the system, not just the grid, but the panel system. And again, because we laid these 2x4s in the wall flat, the panel is only about 2 inches thick. So it's half the thickness of a typical panel, which means now when we're taking these things apart and stacking them in a trailer or finding some storage unit to place them in, they store in half the space that a typical panel would do, which saves a massive amount of space. And when we were trying to figure out how to connect the panels to each other, we went through a lot of different systems trying to figure out what the best way to do that was. The very first haunted house was we actually used small strips of plumbing tape and roof nails. Again, it was back in the 80s and before cordless screw guns, so we were nailing everything together. So that was the first situation. It didn't work very well. It actually worked okay, but it didn't work as nicely as utilizing a bracket. And this is a Simpson strong tie HAuNTcon21 bracket. It comes as a 90 degree. We rarely use 90 degrees except in a facade or in a case where we're breaking the grid and wanted a square room for some kind of illusion or effect that we were doing. So mostly we beat them flat or bend them into 120 degrees. Because that's the majority of walls that you put together, you'll need a 120 degree angle on the bracket. And then 4 inch and 5/8 sheetrock screws will hold that very nicely into the panel. In actuality, the cheapest or the weakest connection, the weakest part of this whole system is the screws. Go into a little bit heftier screw, something that's not as brittle as a sheetrock screw, actually will beef this up. That's not really necessary. That we've been using sheetrock screws in these brackets for a long time. I could not build a haunted house without these brackets. I use them for everything. So check them out. They are a little bit expensive, but you can definitely reuse them. Once you buy one, you never have to replace it because it'll always be there. So when we're doing a 90 degree, you'd have to put the bracket all the way up at the top, all the way at the bottom, because there's no stud in there to catch on the other side. Most of the panels are at 120 degrees to each other. So we put that bracket above shoulder level, and then we put the other bracket at about just above ankle height. That'll keep anybody from scraping themselves on it as they're going through if they're trying to. If I've got 2 straight panels, I'll put 2 on one side, and then I'll put another one on the back side, another bracket on the back side, just to keep it from hinging. And a lot of times, if you're using 8 foot tall panels, when you're putting those together, think about rotating those over. If you lay the first 4x8 panel down, and then set the second one on top of it, utilizing the brackets to hold it together, you don't have that weakness in that center position that you might if you did it the other way. So if you're using 8 foot tall panels, anytime you have an 8 foot span of panel that you're trying to set up, lay that panel down and stack it. Even if you're using a square grid, it still makes a lot of sense to lay that down and stack it rather than trying to deal and brace with that center joint that's not necessary. So and one thing, and what this bracket kept us from doing was having to use 3-inch screws to screw one panel into the other and losing it and tearing the panels up when we take it apart. So that's one of the huge advantages of utilizing a bracket to hold your panels together. And whether I was doing a square grid or a triangular grid, I would still do the same thing. Now when you take all of the brackets off the walls, you know that there's nothing holding that together, and it should come apart. So you're not losing a screw that's gonna tear up your panels. So with a straight connection, as I said, we'll use two brackets on one side and then one on the opposite side just to keep it from hinging. A typical connection is at 120 degrees. If you've got three panels coming in together, now you can use three of those. That's the cleanest connection that you have. If they're coming in at this 60-degree angle, the bracket goes on the end of the panels. It's really hard to screw into this 60-degree angle. Put that on the end of the panels. And if you have a third panel that's coming into that connection, put the two together in the 60-degree angle, and then slide that other one in. Use a flat bracket on the back side of that to connect that all together. Sometimes there's some crazy connections where you have a whole bunch of panels coming in at the same place, and you just have to kind of fudge that together. This fourth panel that's coming into the three that are connected to each other, there's no reason to put a bracket on that. It's not going anywhere, and you can throw a brace on the top of it if you want to. But this is one of the things that some people don't like about the triangular grid system is that it leaves these little V cuts, because it doesn't make any sense at all to miter these panels to make them fit together. So it has these little V cuts, the little voids in them that are just occur with a triangular grid system. If that kind of thing really, really bothers you, then don't use a triangular grid system, because they are throughout and they're very difficult to get rid of. When we first started doing the triangular grid system, we would cut little strips of wood and stick them in there. That didn't last very long because it's a pain, and there's really no reason to do that. So when you're thinking about laying out the grid, how do you, when you're on site and ready to start setting this thing up, or when you're designing it, if you're drawing it in a computer or something, the first thing you need to think about is that a 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot triangle is really kind of the grid. That's our grid. But the height of that triangle is not 4 feet. It's 3'5" and a half or some change. So when you're laying out the grid, it's not a perfect world. Because these panels are not as thin as the grid lines, you're going to have to fudge them in the corners quite a bit. So that's another thing. If you're it's something that you're constantly trying to correct when you're laying out the panels. So when you're laying out this grid, the parallel distance between the lines is 3'6". And then of course the grid sections where the panels would sit are 4 feet each. So when you think about this space, you come in and do these as 3'6" across, and then you do, and then this triangle is still a 4 by 4, give or take, triangle. By doing this, we actually expand the grid slightly, which gives you a little bit of slop to be able to move those panels around and make them fit correctly. So the first thing to do when you're designing a triangular grid system is to lay the building out, draw the building out to scale. Nowadays there's a lot of free programs that you can get, or really inexpensive home building programs that not only will do this, that you can draw this stuff in easily, but it also do it in 3D, so you can take a look at it and what it will look like to walk through it. But you draw the structure to scale, draw your space, make sure you put all of the wall protrusions or any columns or anything that's in the space so that you know where those are, and even just kind of a pipe sticking out of the wall should be noted, because you want to make sure that you've got plenty of clearance around that. Then the next step is set your entrance, know where your entrance and exit are going to be in the building. And by code, the entrance and the exit of the building have to be half the length of the diagonal. So if this was your space that you were utilizing and you measured that diagonal, whatever that diagonal is, the entrance and exit have to be at least half of that distance apart. So theoretically, you could put a haunted house in a space of a shape like this without having a back door to it. But it's nice to have that back door if you can fit it in. And then I always put the entrance and exit right side by side, because I want the people coming out to see the people, or the people going in to see the people that are coming out and see how much of a good time that they're having. But so theoretically, you could put the entrance and exit on both sides of the building. And you definitely want the entrance and exit on the same side of the building, but it's always nice to have that back egress if you can. So now that you know where your entrance and exit are, I come in off of the perimeter 4 feet clear, and I utilize that as an egress corridor. And that's important with the triangular grid system because the corridors in the triangular grid system are less than 3'6" wide. And in the code book, you're allowed to do that as long as you've got an egress corridor, a 42-inch clear, give or take, egress corridor to move people out, so that the hallways in the haunted house do not become the egress corridor. If you do that, then each one of your hallways has to be 42 inches clear. If you utilize a corridor around the perimeter of the attraction that is at least 42 inches wide, now your hallways inside the attraction can be much smaller than that. They theoretically can go down to 36 inches. You wouldn't want to do that because of handicap code, but they can come down much smaller. So the next thing I do is draw the egress corridor on the perimeter. I give myself 4 foot, and then the attraction, the floor plan, the layout of the pathway for the patrons is inside that square. That means I have to cross across that egress corridor twice, but as long as the egress is out, it allows people to go out through that through that little room that I put in there to get to the attraction area, then that's fine. So once you have your egress corridor marked off, you come in with parallel lines at 3'6" on center, all the way across. Typically, I chalk those. It makes it easier for you to figure out what you're doing, especially if you haven't done it for a while or if you've never done it before. Again, we're 4 feet off of this end, and we have a line there, and then we're 3'6" of the bays are 3'6" across going that direction. And then the next thing you do is you start in a corner and come 2 feet off on the first mark, and then the rest of those are 4 feet apart. And then on the second line, you come in 4 feet, and that's 4 feet all the way across. And then you come in 2 feet and 4 feet, 4 feet and 2 feet. And what you end up with, and what I do is just take a little square piece of 1/2-inch tape, and I'll put that dot in place. So I just put a little piece of tape, a dot on that 4 feet all the way down. And what that creates is the triangular grid. You can see there where those dots create that equilateral triangular grid. Because the next step that I'm going to do is come in and actually mark the grid. I'm going to take that 1/2-inch tape and I'm going to mark where all of my walls go on that piece of tape. Mark them all the way through. I'll probably put a symbol in for the door. Some kind of, in my door frames, I make a little tease to make people, so you realize that's a door frame people are walking through. So I have symbols that I also tape on the floor to show the people that are setting the walls up, exactly what goes on there. And I'll even come in and write what kind of panel that is on there. I've got, like SS 4x8 is a single-sided 4x8 panel. I'll put SS 4x8 on that piece of tape. So anybody walking up, and then I'll even put an arrow that shows which side the plywood goes on. So anybody walking up and seeing that says, okay, that's what that panel is. I can go grab one and put it in this place. And in a situation where those panels are pre-painted, where you've set this show up and it's all detailed, that panel might have a number to it. So you put that number on that piece, and then that way you can set it up exactly like it was set up before, or at least similarly if you rearranged it. But so that we come in and tape it before, and then we start setting the panels up. One of the odd things about the triangular grid system is that your rooms aren't going to be square in most cases. So you end up with a room shape that's a large hexagon. A 4x4x4 hexagon shape is pretty small. You can do some things in it, but it's going to be some kind of an equilateral hexagon, either 2 panels or 1 panel wide. It's going to be elongated hexagon, which is 2 panels and then 1 panel in the corners. So that's an 8-foot by 12-foot room, basically. You're going to end up with this rhomboid, which is 2 panels of 1, 3, 1, 2, to create that shape that occurs regularly. And a lot of the stuff that I have occurs just in a hallway. Most of my scares are in a hallway because they're more intimate. And you also get this this one panel, two panels, one panel, two panel, one panel. It's kind of like the shape of a Superman shield, with a big giant S in it. It's upside down in this case, but that's the kind of shape that it ends up. And those are the kind of shaped rooms that you come up with. And in one case, it kind of sets you into a module of these shapes and how do you fit the room into, how do you fit your furniture and how do you fit the pathway into that shape. And it's a little bit limiting in that way. You can't just push this out 2 or 3 inches or a foot. You can't pull that in 6 inches of that. It becomes more structured than that. And so in some cases, a square grid might work better for those kind of things. But I've been able to make this work very well for me. You can break the grid. If you have a room design like my mirror hallway that I use a lot, this requires that this wall be 90 degrees to the world. So to do that, I just come in here and make a panel that's 3'6". Make these 3 panels, the 3 panels at the end of that hallway are 3'6" wide. So they just center up on the grid, go in the wrong direction. So that you can do a square room if you wanted to, by breaking the grid. And another opportunity is these walls are all 4 feet wide. So if you wanted to come off of that and start a square grid section of the haunted house, you could do that as well. So that part of it could be triangular grid, and then part of it could be a square grid. You can't do it with the going the other direction because it's at 3'6" dimension. But you can hybrid this thing together and be triangular grid for part of it and square grid for the rest of it. You can also break the grid by using a 2x2 grid instead of a 4x4 grid. So in many cases, what I'll do is shift everything over by 2 foot by utilizing a 2 foot panel someplace. That's a 4 foot door, so there's another 4 foot panel and a 2 foot panel in there to get that length, and that allows you to have, especially backstage corridors. Make those narrower than a pathway for an actor or for a patron. So you can break the grid, and I'm doing a lot more of that these days. I didn't do it very often when I first started doing this, but more recently I'm doing this a lot, so that now my grid that I put on the thing originally is a 2x2 grid, and that gives me a lot of flexibility in changing room sizes by a 1.5 foot or 18 inches or something instead of a full 3'6". So we talked about installation a little bit. This is what a triangular grid plan would typically look like, and you got to figure out where all those walls go. So when you're thinking about doing the installation, chalk lines, lots of masking tape, tape measures, 4 foot tape measures, 100 foot tape measures to make this the process easy as possible. The first thing I do is lay the carpet. I'll come into the space and mark the 4 feet around the perimeter, and then I'll lay out carpet. We use indoor, outdoor, office kind of, cheapest carpet we can find in a medium gray. Sometimes if the theme calls for it, we'll change the color to a red or something like that. But typically it's a medium gray, and lay that out first. Then come back in 4 feet off the wall, and then 3'6" all the way across, starting with 2 feet, and then 4 feet, and then 4 feet, and 2 foot and 4 feet, and just create the same situation. Mark the grid, tape out the floor plan. So this is here's my parallel lines. There are my little tape marks on the grid, which makes the rest of the grid show up. Once I have the floor plan taped out on the floor, now's the time to set your large props. So now that you know where the rooms are, you can carry your large props and put them in place before you ever set the walls up. That keeps you from having to drag, a giant animatronic down a hallway that's too narrow for it to fit into. So once the floor plan is taped, I'll go in and set the large props in place. And so I know where all of that stuff is, and large pieces of furniture or anything that's bigger than I want to carry down the hallway, I'll put those in before we start setting the walls up. And then you start bracketing the panels, stand the panels up, start bracketing them together. Once you have all the full panels up, I go back in and do the doors, before we brace the attraction. So we'll go back in and hinge the doors, make sure that they're working properly before we brace everything. So you hinge all the doors to make sure that they're where they're supposed to be, make sure the props are in place. And then we brace all the panels. And bracing the panels, if this is your floor plan and you're trying to brace all these things, the distance between each one of these points is 8 feet. So a 1 foot, 8 foot, 1x4, or 1x3 laid across the top of that will brace all three of those points. So what you end up doing as you're bracing, you brace on the grid, so that as you're doing it, you're actually just completing the grid. Any place that there's a wall, but there's not a grid line, we put a board in. We put a 1x4 across the top. And what's nice about a 1x4 is that in some situations, you may have to lap 3 or 4 boards over across the top of the same point. And a 1x4 will do that. A 2x4 won't. And all of those pieces are in tension from a structural standpoint. Somebody pushing out on a wall is putting that board in tension. So you don't really need a 2x4 out there unless you got a swing or something hanging from it. All you really need is a 1x4, 1x3. Whatever's the cheapest, whatever's the easiest to get. And then you basically complete the grid. I mean, you literally, everywhere that there's not a panel on the grid line, you put a piece of lumber in. And typically, I don't do these that are 12 feet long unless I'm hanging a chandelier or something in the middle of it. Typically, I do most of my bracing with 8 foot long pieces, just because they're easier to get and cheap. But in some cases, I'll just put a 2x4 across if I need to hang something heavy on and joist hanger that to both panels. But what you're really doing is completing the grid. And once you do that, there's no way that you can move any of these panels. If you body slam one panel, you're pulling on the panels on the opposite side of the wall of that, and every panel, within the entire floor plan. I mean, you're literally laying a triangular truss across the entire top of the haunted house, and it's not going anywhere. Now you might have a situation where one of these panels just stops. When you're a situation where people are walking around on both sides of the same panel, the bottoms of those, if somebody body slams that, you just have to try to make sure that you don't have a scare that's pushing people into that point. And if it's an issue, just put a door frame in. You just grab a door frame panel and put it in and hinge that into that corner. And then that point will never move either. So it's an extremely strong system, very very structurally solid. And again, freestanding, you don't have to brace it on anything. It's not attached to the floor, so you're not having to screw stuff into the floor. It's a complete system from the carpet all the way to the bracing. Even the bracing is easier to screw through. And one of the things you think about, a 1x4 is really bad about splitting. If you put a screw very close to the end of the 1x4, it's going to split. So pre-drill those holes and then pre-drill one in the middle, so that when you put a panel on right where it goes on both ends, the screw will kind of tell you where that panel should be in the middle, and because you'll have to pull those panels around a little bit to make them fit underneath the bracing. And realize that the distance between the points on the triangles are 4 feet or 8 feet apart. Realizing that board is exactly 8 feet, it means every brace that you're going to use is going to be slightly short. So you have to turn it slightly to be able to catch something to screw down into. But if you pre-drill those holes, it'll keep you from splitting the ends of the 1x4s. It makes it much, much easier for the install. So now that you have the panels braced, this is what the top of a show would look like with 1x4 bracing. Again, you can see there that in this connection right here at the front, that brace doesn't even sit on this panel. It doesn't even sit on the next panel. It could have. I don't know why it didn't, but this, you're completing the grid. So as you walk through the haunted house when it's properly braced, all you're going to see is triangles. If you put a brace up and then you have 12 inches extra on one end of the brace, it's in the wrong place, because in each case the brace is going to be just slightly short. So we run our electrical, and especially in a temporary installation, we run our electrical, run our air, run everything across the top of the panels. Your next step is to set the lights so that you know where you need power. Then you go in and run your electrical, run your air across the top. keeps it out of trip hazard and away from patrons and actors alike. So let's talk about disadvantages of the triangular grid system. There are no 90-degree corners unless you break the grid and start building panels that are 3'6" wide. You can make a 90-degree room, but typically they're not. Some people have said that's the reason they don't use a triangular grid system, because all rooms are square. I guarantee you 90% of the people that go through a haunted house will never notice that it's a triangular grid system unless you're really looking for it. And some types of structures, it makes sense for them not to be 90 degrees. If the theme of your haunted house is a spaceship or a Victorian mansion, chances are good the majority of those walls wouldn't be 90 degrees to each other anyway. So that's a disadvantage, but not a huge one anyway. Gaps in the connections, where you've got the panels coming together, there are going to be gaps in the connections. If that bothers you, don't do it, because it's a pain to fix. So that's a disadvantage. Room size increments, it's hard to make a 5 foot wide corridor. You can make something that's bigger than 3'6", but it's either 7 feet or something between those two. So the room increments, that's a disadvantage. It's a little bit structured, but again, I've been able to do anything for the 30 years, 40 years that I've been doing this without any problem. So it's not that big of a disadvantage. The rooms are odd shaped, yeah, but that's kind of cool. And the pathway is very convoluted, so I think that's a plus. The panels are light, they're narrower, they're lighter, so they don't stand up, they don't stay in place as well as a heavier panel would. So that's one disadvantage. Benefits of a triangular grid system is, there are no 90-degree corners. I mean, it's much stronger. The system is stronger. There's no 90-degree corners. You can make 90-degree corners if you need them, but they're not really necessary. And to be honest, it's a benefit. It mazes up, it twists and turns up the pathway substantially, so it makes it actually a benefit. It's a freestanding system. It does not attach to the floor. It doesn't need to attach to the floor. It stands up by itself. Even if with football players body slamming the walls going through, it's a very strong system. It's not going anywhere, and except for the bottoms where you might have a panel get off center, put a door frame in it, or even put a threshold in there, or just a little piece of a ramp on one side to secure that, and it's not a problem. So it's definitely a freestanding system, which is good. It's quick install and strike. I mean, it goes together very quickly. You can easily set up the walls in a 3,000 or 4,000 square foot haunted house in a couple of days, especially once you know what you're doing and your crew is good. 3-man crews are best. One guy going to get a panel, one guy holding the panel, one guy screwing the panel. And that and repeat. It goes together very quickly. For on a safety issue, you want to make sure that they put the top bracket on first, and then put the bottom bracket on, because the guy on the other side of the wall doesn't know what you're doing, and then if you put the bottom bracket on, he thinks you put the top bracket on and walks away, and the panel falls over and hits you. So just make sure that you put the top bracket on first, bottom bracket on second. When you take it apart, you do the opposite. You take the bottom bracket off first and the top bracket off second. And this thing is a house of cards until it's braced. You can't have a situation where you lean 3 or 4 panels up against the wall and those go over. It's going to take out a chunk of the show until it's braced. Once it's braced, it's not going anywhere. But it is a little bit structurally unsound until you brace it. But I would imagine that's true with a square grid as well. But it goes together fast. It's easy to change. I'm notorious for going into my haunted house at 5 o'clock on Halloween and rearranging a section around one of the scares. It's not working as well as I thought it was, to the dismay of the actors that go running into their room trying to get in their spot and run square into a wall that wasn't there yesterday. But hey, keeps them on their toes. So literally you can take a section of the show down and put it back up in hours instead of days or weeks if you were shooting it into the ground. Makes it much easier to move, to change, to rearrange, and stores in half the space. Structural integrity is huge. It's just not going anywhere. It's all tied together. When braced properly, it's not going anywhere. It's the strongest system out there. We brace with 1x3s instead of 2x4s, so that you're not having to drive that. You don't even have to use your impact wrench to screw that down, especially if the holes are pre-drilled. There's more pathway per square foot. This is a typical U-turn for a square grid. If you do that same pathway in a triangular grid, you're saving width because the wall pathways are only 3'6" instead of 4 feet. And you're clipping off the corners that are wasted in a pathway anyway. No one's ever going to walk into those 90-degree corners. So you clip those off a little bit and save some square feet, save some area there. So, in this, just in one U-turn, we've saved 26 square feet that we then throw into the next corridor, which then is thrown into the next corridor. And by the time you go, 100 feet or however long your haunted house is, that's some substantial savings in room that you can increase your pathway or increase the size of the rooms. It's substantial. It allows you to put much more linear pathway in the same square footage as you can with the square grid. Benefits: wider panels. These are actually 10-foot tall panels. Everything I build today are 10 feet tall or 12s. I even do 12s in some cases, and I've been known to stack 2 8s and create a room that's 16 feet tall by half the ceiling height. So these are 10s. That's my typical panel these days. The panels are lighter. That means I can walk up to this, even as old as I am, lean this panel out and carry it across the floor by utilizing my hips. You back up to the wall, bend your knees a little bit, grab the panel, lean it over onto your hips, and then you can pick it up and walk it across the floor. So one guy can carry panels while you're installing. One guy can pick up a panel and carry it to you without having to have massive guns, big arm muscles to be able to carry it, because he's not using his arms, he's using his hands, and he's using his legs to carry the panel. In my youth, I could pick up 2 panels and carry them across the floor. Not so much anymore. Cheaper construction. You're using way less 2x4s. The 2x2s are cheaper. 2x3s are cheaper than 2x4s typically, and so you're using cheaper materials, and you're utilizing the material better. You're not having, and it saves a huge amount of time because you're not screwing the 2x to each other. Panels are half the thickness of a typical panel, so it stores in half the space, which is amazing because you can put a whole lot of haunted house into a very small space. I actually currently have a 1,500 square foot haunted house that is stored in a 20 by 20 storage unit, and there's leftover room in there, even with the props and stuff that go with that haunt and the facade. It all fits nicely in a 20 by 20. In fact, I hauled it to location. It was just a one-night haunt that a guy wanted to do. I hauled it to location in a 20-foot panel truck. So the thinner panels allow you for a lot less storage space, which is great if you're taking it down and putting it back up. And even if you're not taking it down and putting it back up every season, you're going to want to change stuff. It's much easier to take these brackets off and move some panels around than it is to shoot these and take the nails out that you shot into the floor through the bottom of the panel, trying to hold them in place. And there's no scrap. And this is something I just kind of realized recently, in that a 2-sided panel, none of those members have to be full length. So if you're building a 10-foot, if you want to go 10-foot tall panels, but you don't want to put up the extra money for a 10-foot long 2x4, you can't even get a 10-foot long 2x3, I don't think. So all you have to do is throw in an extra piece of 2x3. You can use 8-foot and 2-foot pieces of 2x3, and because there's plywood on both sides of that, it doesn't matter. So you never have to have any scrap. You literally could build a panel with 6-inch pieces of 2x4 and completely. So really, unless you're just lazy and not want to put a bunch of screws in it, you can utilize all of your scrap when you're building the 2-sided panels. Now, the 1-sided panels, it's more important for those to have to go full length, or at least make sure that you're gusseting the brace between the 2 pieces of lumber. But but you literally can do this with no scrap. And you never have to screw through a 2x4 again. You never have to jump, you never have to get out the hammer drill and screw those members to each other, because it's the plywood that's holding everything together anyway. When not to use a triangle grid system, if you've got a space that has way too many columns, it's really hard. You end up losing a lot of space. Even a 2-inch diameter post that's right dead center, it falls right dead center in the middle of one of the triangle paths. Unless it's a backstage corridor or something with some kind of something that people are supposed to walk in anyway. It really makes you lose a lot of space. You could more easily hide that in a 4-inch thick wall or a square grid wall. It'd be much easier to hide than it is with a triangular grid system. So if your space has a lot of columns in it, then the triangular grid system probably is not beneficial. If you have a bunch of existing walls, and this space is a prison or a hotel or something that has a lot of school, has a lot of walls in it, then triangular grid probably doesn't save you anything. You might as well go square or something else. And sometimes it just doesn't fit the way the coursing comes out. Whether the 3'6", and you can rotate it the other way. You can put you can have the long side be the soft edge. If you'll notice on the floor plans, one edge is nice and straight on the 3'6", on those lines. But the other corner, the other pathway on the other corner is got a 2-foot offset, saw cut going back and forth. And you can always rotate that the other way and make that go the long distance, although rarely does that work better. But sometimes because of the coursing, the 4-foot square grid works better. So sometimes it just doesn't fit. When definitely to use a triangular grid system, when you have limited space, because you can put a whole lot of haunted house in a very small space using the triangular grid system because of the thickness of the walls and because of the narrowness of the corridors. Tent haunted houses, we started doing tent haunted houses in Dallas because we just couldn't find old buildings that were vacant, and that's a viable option. You can bring the haunted house to the people instead of having to find that cool old building that's in the middle of nowhere and have to spend the marketing money to drive them to the haunted house. You can bring the haunted house to them, something that wasn't there yesterday, everybody driving by it. And as long as it really looks like a haunted house, like this one does, you're going to get some good word of mouth. This facade is built the exact same way we build the interior panels. Those are all 4x8 or smaller wall panels, 2-inch thick wall panels, built exactly the way we would build the interior wall panels. They're bracketed together, they're stacked, and they have floors in them to hold everything in place. But but those are panels. Those are triangular grid panels, just like the ones that are inside. Some of them have those windows built into them. Some of them are oddball shaped, but the whole thing just goes together and is all held together with the brackets. And somebody says, well, what about wind? The Simpson strong tie bracket is considered a hurricane tie. Those are designed to hold your building to the ground when there's a hurricane. So definitely they're going to be able to hold your haunted house together if there's a heavy wind. Temporary install, definitely do a triangular grid system because it's fast, quick to set up, stores in less space. So that's definitely a plus. Permanent install, same thing. It doesn't matter whether I'm doing something that's temporary or permanent. I design them exactly the same way. Triangular grid system works great for permanent install because you can rearrange it. Go in an afternoon and change some stuff up, make it fresh for that Friday if you wanted to. So it's definitely a good opportunity to use a triangular grid system. If you don't have anything to brace to and it's got to be freestanding, or you're putting it on, a bumper car building. We've done these attractions on floors, on marble floors that you couldn't do anything to the floor. Some of the other methods you would not be able to do that because they wouldn't stand up. But triangular grid system is great for that. If you need to do quick changes, definitely triangular grid system is the way to go. And I thought I was so smart. I came up with this brand new concept, never been done with the haunted house industry before, utilizing triangles to create an attraction pathway. I thought I was really smart and really creative. And then I was walking through a carnival one day and looked over and saw a glass house. And I looked at the floor of the glass house and I said, that's triangular grid, as is every mirror maze that's ever been made, or most of them. I've seen some square ones now, but the majority of the old style arcade mirror mazes are all done also in a triangular grid system. So I thought I was inventing something brand new. Come to find out, there are no new ideas. There are only two old ideas put together for the first time. So at least I was the first one to utilize this in a haunted house venue, but definitely was not the first one. I certainly didn't invent it. What is the future of the triangular grid system? Tall panels. My standard panel is a 10-foot tall panel now. I like 12s. They're a little bit harder to manage, a little bit harder to put the. Really? Sorry. Tall panels are definitely the future. New connection systems. I've been playing with some brackets that would be quicker and easier to do for connecting the panels to each other. That's definitely something that's coming down the pike. New materials, coming up with something different than plywood and lumber to build the walls out of is also something that is that is coming. You know, there's a lot of new materials that people are using to build buildings with, and plastics and that kind of stuff that are flame retardant, that are definitely going to be something that will be added to the triangular grid system in the future, and other grids. This is actually a 4-foot grid. It has 2-foot panels in it as well, but it actually works as a 4-foot grid. It doesn't really make sense to do a haunted house maze out of that, a haunted house pathway out of that, but certainly is something that you know, and some other things that I've been playing with that are interesting, that might show themselves someday. So I hope that has been clear, and that you've kind of gotten the premise for what a triangular system, what the triangular grid system is, and how it works, and how I've been utilizing it in the haunted house industry. As have many people. There have been several people that have adopted the triangular grid system and utilize it in their own attractions. And it's fun to be going out and seeing haunted houses every once in a while, and walk into a haunted house and recognize the fact that somebody's been utilizing the triangular grid system. So thanks for listening. I do have a booklet that I sell that's got 30 different attraction layouts in it. Some of them are triangular grid, a few of them are square, but most of them are triangular grid. But that's for sale on my website if you're interested in grabbing that. And if there's anything that I can help you with, if you'd like be sure to give me a call. If you'd like a copy of the outline of this presentation, shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to send you an outline for it, so that you can go back and check your notes and figure out how to do this. You know, a lot of people seem to be afraid of it because of you know, it's complicated, but the benefits definitely outweigh the negatives, and hopefully you guys will be able to utilize it and come up with some new stuff, and someday you can share it with me. Many years ago, I realized that me by myself in my own little bubble can only go so far. That you have to share what you know with other people that have similar interests, so that they can take your ideas further than what you ever dreamed of taking them. And that way you can learn from them and go further than you'd ever be able to go by yourself. And that was really the beginning of my path through the haunted house industry, both with Haunted Attraction Magazine and with HauNTcon. You know, sharing ideas is always the best part of going to a convention, and hopefully this information will help you guys take these ideas and take them to the next level and teach me a thing or two someday. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great next few days with HauNTcon and our virtual reality convention.
Thank you so much, Leonard. Just as a reminder, if anybody has any questions, you could reach out to Leonard with the contact information on his last slide, or through the HauNTcon virtual experience by sending him a message or setting up a meeting. We hope everybody enjoys the rest of the show.
Bye, everybody.